The screaming stopped at exactly 11:47 p.m., and that's when Jade Martinez knew she'd become a coward. She stood frozen at her apartment window, phone clutched in her trembling hand, watching the empty alley where moments before a woman had been fighting for her life. Jade pressed her face against the cold glass, searching the shadows for any sign of movement. The woman's desperate cries still echoed in her ears. "Help me, please, somebody help me." But now there was only silence. Terrible, suffocating silence that seemed to mock every second Jade had hesitated. She should have called 911 immediately. Should have screamed out the window. Should have grabbed the baseball bat she kept by her door and run downstairs. But she hadn't done any of those things. Instead, she'd stood paralyzed, watching through her fourth-floor window like she was observing some distant movie scene rather than witnessing real violence happening 60 feet below. The rational part of her mind had catalogued every detail with clinical precision. 2 men, both wearing dark hoodies. The victim was a young woman, maybe 25, with long blonde hair. She'd been carrying a purse and walking alone when they'd cornered her behind the dumpster. The attack had lasted maybe 3 minutes, but it felt like hours. Now the alley was empty except for scattered contents of the woman's purse glinting in the weak streetlight. Jade's hands shook as she finally dialed 911, but even as she waited for the operator to answer, she knew it was too late. She'd failed in the most fundamental way a human being could fail. She'd watched evil happen and done nothing to stop it. 911, what's your emergency? There was an attack. In the alley behind my building. 2 men attacked a woman. Jade's voice sounded hollow even to herself. They're gone now. Are you injured, ma'am? No, I was watching from my window. I saw the whole thing. The admission felt like swallowing glass. She gave her address and answered the dispatcher's questions with mechanical precision, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying those crucial moments when she could have acted but didn't. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance. Red and blue lights painted her apartment walls as emergency vehicles filled the street below. Jade watched paramedics and police officers swarm the alley, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like accusing fingers. A knock at her door made her jump. 2 police officers stood in the hallway, their expressions professionally neutral but somehow judgmental. Detective Sarah Chun was small and intense, with sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. Her partner, Detective Mike Rodriguez, was older, with the weathered face of someone who'd seen too much human cruelty. Ms. Martinez? I'm Detective Chen. We understand you witnessed the attack. Jade nodded, stepping aside to let them in. Her apartment suddenly felt tiny and exposed, like a fishbowl with nowhere to hide. The officers took in her modest living space, the psychology textbooks scattered across her coffee table, the certificates on her wall proclaiming her a licensed social worker. The irony of someone whose job was helping people having failed so spectacularly when it mattered most. Tell us what you saw, Detective Rodriguez said gently, settling into her worn armchair. Jade recounted the events, her voice growing smaller with each detail. She described the attackers as best she could, though she realized now how little she'd actually observed. Had one been taller than the other? Were they young or middle-aged? Had they said anything? The questions revealed the inadequacy of her passive witnessing. How long did you watch before calling for help? Detective Chun asked, her pen poised over her notepad. The question hit like a physical blow. Jade felt heat rise in her cheeks. It happened so fast. Maybe 2 or 3 minutes? The attack lasted approximately 4 minutes according to other witnesses, Detective Chen said matter-of-factly. Several people in neighboring buildings saw the incident. You were the closest with the clearest view, other witnesses. Jade's stomach dropped. She wasn't the only one who'd watched. How many people had stood at their windows, frozen by the same inexplicable paralysis that had gripped her? Did you see what happened to the victim? Detective Rodriguez asked. They dragged her away toward the back of the alley. I couldn't see ... Jade's voice broke. Is she ... Did you find her? The officers exchanged a look that made Jade's blood run cold. We're still searching, Detective Chen said carefully. Every minute counts in cases like this. Sometimes the difference between life and death comes down to how quickly someone acts. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Jade understood the subtext clearly. If she'd called sooner, if she'd made noise, if she'd done anything besides stand frozen like a statue, maybe the outcome would be different. After the police left, Jade sat alone in her dark apartment, staring out at the alley where crime scene tape now fluttered in the wind. She'd spent 5 years as a social worker, helping families in crisis, advocating for the vulnerable, convincing herself she was one of the good people who made a difference in the world. But when it truly mattered, when someone needed her most, she discovered something terrible about herself. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't even decent. She was just another face in the crowd, another bystander who watched evil happen and did nothing. The realization felt like a fundamental shift in her understanding of who she was as a person. Jade's phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor at the Family Services office. Saw the news about the attack in your neighborhood. Hope you're okay. See you Monday. But Jade wasn't okay. She might never be okay again. Because she learned something about human nature that her psychology textbooks had never adequately explained, that good intentions and moral convictions meant nothing when fear paralyzed your ability to act. She learned that the distance between being a good person and being a coward was exactly 60 feet and 4 minutes of silence. As she finally closed her curtains and turned away from the window, Jade wondered if the other witnesses were experiencing the same crushing realization. Were they lying in bed right now, replaying their inaction, questioning everything they thought they knew about themselves? Or had they already found ways to rationalize their behavior, to convince themselves they'd done nothing wrong? Tomorrow she would have to face her clients, people who looked to her for guidance and support, knowing she'd failed the most basic test of human decency. Tomorrow she would have to pretend she was still the person she'd been 24 hours ago, before she discovered what she was really made of when it mattered most. But tonight, she would lie awake, haunted by the sound of screaming that stopped too soon and the terrible silence that followed. Jade barely slept, and when she finally dragged herself to work Monday morning, she looked like she'd aged years in 3 days. The family services office buzzed with its usual chaos, crying children, frustrated parents, overworked caseworkers juggling impossible caseloads, but everything felt different now. Every interaction seemed to mock her recent failure to act when someone needed help most. "Rough weekend?" her colleague Marcus asked, settling into the cubicle next to hers with his usual Monday morning coffee. Marcus was one of those naturally good people who seemed to radiate compassion effortlessly. Jade had always admired his ability to maintain optimism despite the heartbreaking cases they handled daily. "Something like that," Jade mumbled, unable to meet his eyes. How could she explain that she'd discovered she wasn't the person she thought she was? That all her years of social work, all her advocacy for the vulnerable, had been revealed as mere performance when tested by real crisis? Her phone rang, interrupting her spiral of self-recrimination. Detective Chun's name appeared on the caller ID, and Jade's stomach lurched. "Ms. Martinez, we need you to come to the station this morning. We have some updates about the case, and we need you to look at some photographs." An hour later, Jade sat in a sterile police interview room, staring at a series of mugshots spread across a metal table. The fluorescent lighting was harsh and unforgiving, making everyone look guilty of something. Detective Chun sat across from her while Detective Rodriguez leaned against the wall, both watching her reactions carefully. "Take your time," Detective Chun said. "Look at each face carefully. Do any of these men look familiar?" Jade studied the photographs, but the faces blurred together. She'd been so focused on the victim, so paralyzed by her own inaction, that she'd barely registered the attacker's features. The realization of how little she'd actually observed, despite having the best vantage point, made her feel even more inadequate. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "It was dark, and I was so far away, ... You were 62 feet away according to our measurements," Detective Rodriguez said. "That's well within the range where facial features should be distinguishable, especially with the streetlight illumination." Jade felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I know I should have seen more. I should have paid better attention. I should have..." "Ms. Martinez," Detective Chen interrupted gently, "we're not here to judge your actions. We're trying to find Hannah Morrison." Hannah Morrison. The victim had a name now, which somehow made everything worse. She wasn't just an anonymous woman in an alley. She was Hannah Morrison, 26 years old, a nurse at City General Hospital. Someone's daughter, sister, friend. Someone whose life had been torn apart while Jade watched from her window. "We found her purse contents, but no sign of Hannah herself," Detective Chun continued. "We're treating this as an abduction case now. Every detail you can remember might help us find her." Detective Rodriguez pushed a laptop across the table. "We'd like you to watch some security footage. Maybe seeing the incident again will help jog your memory." The grainy black and white footage began playing, and Jade felt sick watching the events unfold from a different angle. A security camera from the adjacent building had captured part of the attack, though the image quality was poor and the angle limited. She watched herself in the window of her apartment building, a tiny figure frozen in place while violence unfolded below. "There," Detective Chun pointed at the screen. "That's you in the window. Can you tell us what you were thinking during this moment? Why you didn't call out or make noise?" Jade stared at her own image, a motionless silhouette that could have been a mannequin for all the action it took. "I don't know. I kept thinking someone else would do something. That other people were watching too, and someone would handle it. I thought maybe I was misunderstanding what I was seeing." "The bystander effect," Detective Rodriguez nodded. "It's more common than you'd think." Kitty Genovese, 1964. Dozens of people watched her get attacked outside her apartment building in New York. Everyone assumed someone else would call for help. Jade knew the case. It was cited in every psychology textbook as a classic example of diffusion of responsibility. But knowing about the phenomenon intellectually and experiencing it personally were entirely different things. She'd failed the most basic test of human decency, and academic labels didn't make it hurt less. "The thing is," Detective Chun said, freezing the video on a frame showing Jade at her window, "you weren't the only witness. We've identified at least 6 other people who saw the attack from various windows and balconies." "Want to guess how many called 911? Jade's throat felt dry. "How many?" 1. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson from the 2nd floor called at 11:51 p.m. 4 minutes after the attack ended. She was 83 years old with arthritis and poor eyesight, but she was the only person who actually picked up a phone. The information hit Jade like a physical blow. An elderly woman with limited mobility had shown more courage than she had. More courage than any of the other younger, more capable witnesses who'd stood paralyzed by their own psychological limitations. Detective Rodriguez pulled out another folder. "We interviewed all the witnesses yesterday. Want to hear their explanations?" "I thought someone else would call. It happened so fast, I wasn't sure what I was seeing. I didn't want to get involved. I was afraid they might come after me if they knew I was watching." "Everyone had a reason," Detective Chun added. "Everyone had a perfectly logical explanation for why they didn't act. But Hannah Morrison is still missing, and our best chance of finding her alive diminished with every minute that passed while good people stood at their windows doing nothing." Jade felt tears threatening. "What can I do now? How can I help?" "Keep thinking. Sometimes witnesses remember details later, when they're not in shock. Here's my card." Detective Chun slid her business card across the table. "If anything comes back to you, anything at all, call immediately." Walking back to work, Jade felt like she was seeing the city differently. How many people walked these streets knowing they'd failed someone when it mattered most? How many carried the weight of inaction, of moments when they'd chosen safety over courage, self-preservation over human decency? Back at her desk, She found it impossible to concentrate on her case files. Every family crisis she was supposed to help resolve seemed trivial compared to Hannah Morrison's disappearance. How could she counsel parents about protecting their children when she'd failed to protect a complete stranger who needed her help? Marcus appeared at her cubicle with a concerned expression. "Jade, you look terrible. What's going on?" For a moment, she considered telling him everything. Marcus would understand, would offer comfort and perspective. But she couldn't bear the thought of seeing disappointment in his eyes, of watching him realize that she wasn't the person he thought she was. "Just tired," she said. "Didn't sleep well." But as she sat there pretending to review case files, Jade made a decision. She couldn't change what had happened, couldn't undo her failure to act. But maybe she could still help find Hannah Morrison. Maybe she could prove to herself that she was capable of courage, even if it came too late. She pulled out Detective Chun's card and stared at the phone number. Somewhere out there, Hannah Morrison might still be alive, still need saving. And this time, Jade wasn't going to stand at the window watching someone else handle it. She was going to act. Jade couldn't sleep again Tuesday night, but this time it wasn't just guilt keeping her awake. She'd spent hours replaying the security footage Detective Chen had shown her, studying every frame for details she might have missed. At 3 a.m., she sat at her kitchen table with a notebook, sketching everything she could remember about the attackers. One had been taller than the other, maybe 6 feet compared to 5'8". The shorter one had done most of the talking, though she couldn't make out words from her window. There had been something about his posture, the way he gestured during the attack, that seemed familiar somehow. But the memory was frustratingly vague, like trying to grasp smoke. Her phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "Stop looking or you'll end up like Hannah." Jade's blood turned to ice. Someone knew she was investigating. Someone was watching her watch them. She screenshot the message with trembling fingers and immediately called Detective Chen. "How did they get my number?" Jade asked when the detective answered on the second ring. "Good question. We'll trace the number, but it's probably a burner phone. More importantly, this means you're onto something. What have you been doing differently since yesterday?" Jade explained about studying the footage, making sketches, trying to reconstruct the scene. "There was something familiar about one of the attackers, but I can't place it. Don't force it. Memory works better when you're not trying so hard." "But Jade," Detective Chun's voice turned serious, "you need to be careful. If they're threatening you, it means they're worried about what you might remember. Stay in public places, vary your routine, and call me if anything feels off." After hanging up, Jade realized she felt something she hadn't experienced since the attack, a sense of purpose. For the first time in days, she wasn't just a passive witness consumed by guilt. She was actively trying to help, even if it meant putting herself at risk. Wednesday morning brought news that made her stomach drop. Detective Rodriguez called to tell her they'd found Hannah Morrison's purse in a dumpster 12 blocks away, along with her hospital ID badge and personal items. But no Hannah. The items were deliberately placed where they'd be found, Rodriguez explained. Someone's playing games with us. They want us to know they have her, but they're not ready to reveal her location. Jade made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation she possessed. I want to help with the search. I know the neighborhood better than anyone. Maybe I can think like them, figure out where they might take someone. Absolutely not, Detective Chen said when Rodriguez put her on speaker. You're a civilian, and you've already been threatened. We can't have you wandering around playing detective, but I know this area. I've worked with families here for 5 years. I know the abandoned buildings, the places where someone could hide. Jade surprised herself with her insistence. I can't just sit in my apartment doing nothing while Hannah's still out there. There was silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Detective Chen sighed. If you're going to do this, you don't go alone. Rodriguez will partner with you. And the moment anything feels dangerous, you back off. Understood? That afternoon, Jade found herself walking through her neighborhood with new eyes. Detective Rodriguez was a reassuring presence beside her, his hand resting casually near his weapon while they explored potential hiding places. They checked abandoned warehouses, empty lots, condemned buildings, anywhere someone might stash a kidnapping victim. Tell me about the familiar feeling you mentioned, Rodriguez said as they approached an old textile factory that had been closed for years. Sometimes our subconscious picks up details our conscious mind misses. Jade closed her eyes, trying to recreate that moment of recognition. It was the way he moved. Confident, but not reckless, like someone who knew the area well. And when he gestured to his partner, it reminded me of ... quote. She paused, the memory solidifying. Oh my God. What? Tommy Russo. I had a case with his family 2 years ago. His younger sister was being abused by their stepfather. Tommy was furious that the system wasn't moving fast enough to protect her. Jade's pulse quickened. He had the same gestures, the same way of moving. And he knew this neighborhood inside and out grew up here. Rodriguez was already pulling out his phone. We need to run Tommy Russo through the system. If he's been in trouble since your case. 20 minutes later, they had their answer. Tommy Russo, now 24, had been arrested 6 months earlier for assault. The charges were dropped when the victim refused to testify, but he'd been spotted in the area several times recently. His last known address was only 8 blocks from where Hannah had been taken. This is good work, Jade, Rodriguez said as they headed toward Tommy's address. But from here on, you stay in the car. We don't know what we're walking into. But when they arrived at Tommy's listed address, the apartment was empty. The landlord said he'd moved out weeks ago without leaving a forwarding address. Another dead end, or so it seemed. As they stood outside the abandoned apartment building, Jade noticed something that made her heart race. Across the street was the old Murphy's Deli building, closed for renovation but not yet demolished. She remembered Tommy mentioning it during their family sessions, how he and his friends used to hang out in the basement when they were kids. Detective Rodriguez, she said quietly, I think I know where she is." They called for backup before approaching the building. The front entrance was boarded up, but Rodriguez found a side door that had been forced open recently. Inside, the building was a maze of construction debris and shadows. But from somewhere deep in the basement, they could hear something that made Jade's blood freeze. Crying, weak, desperate crying that could only be coming from Hannah Morrison. "Stay behind me," Rodriguez whispered, drawing his weapon. "And whatever happens, don't try to be a hero." But as they crept down the basement stairs, Jade realized she was already being a hero, not the kind she'd fantasized about being, but the kind that mattered. She was here, putting herself at risk, refusing to stand by while someone suffered. She wasn't the same person who'd frozen at her window 5 days ago. The basement was darker than she'd expected, lit only by Rodriguez's flashlight. In the far corner, they could see a figure tied to a chair, blonde hair matted, clothes torn, but alive. Hannah Morrison was alive, and standing behind her, exactly as Jade had remembered him, was Tommy Russo. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out," he said calmly, not seeming surprised to see them. "Always were too smart for your own good. Ms. Martinez should have minded your own business like everyone else." Rodriguez kept his weapon trained on Tommy while speaking into his radio, calling for immediate backup. But Jade found herself stepping forward, falling back on her social work training. "Tommy, this isn't you. I remember working with your family. You were trying to protect your sister, not hurt innocent people." "Innocent?" Tommy's laugh was bitter. "You know what Hannah Morrison did? She was the nurse who treated my sister when she came to the emergency room beaten half to death. And she sent her right back home to her abuser because my sister was too scared to tell the truth." Jade felt pieces clicking into place. "So this was never random. You targeted her specifically. The system failed my sister, and Hannah was part of that system. Just like you all were." Tommy's eyes were wild now, years of anger and helplessness finally finding an outlet. "Everyone who could have saved her just stood by and watched. Like I did," Jade said quietly. "Like I stood by and watched when you took her." The admission seemed to catch Tommy off guard. In that moment of confusion, Rodriguez moved. The confrontation was over in seconds. Tommy disarmed and on the ground, backup flooding the basement, paramedics rushing to Hannah's side. As they brought Hannah Morrison up from that dark basement, alive but traumatized, Jade realized something had fundamentally changed inside her. She would never again be the person who stood at the window watching evil happen. She'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was acting despite the fear, refusing to let someone else's suffering be dismissed as someone else's responsibility. But she also understood something darker about human nature. Tommy Russo wasn't a monster. He was someone who'd watched his sister suffer while good people did nothing, and that helplessness had twisted into rage. The bystander effect had victims on both sides, those who suffered while others watched, and those who watched while others suffered. The difference was what you did with that knowledge afterward. 3 weeks later, Jade stood in the witness box of courtroom 4B, her hand steady on the Bible as she swore to tell the truth. The entire truth this time, not the carefully edited version she'd been living with since that night in March. Tommy Russo sat at the defendant's table, looking smaller and more broken than the angry young man she'd confronted in the basement. "Ms. Martinez," the prosecutor began, "you've testified that you witnessed the initial assault on Hannah Morrison. Can you tell the court why you didn't immediately call for help?" The question she'd been dreading hung in the air. Jade looked out at the packed courtroom, Hannah Morrison in the front row, her recovery slow but steady. Detective Chun and Rodriguez at the prosecutor's table. Her supervisor from Family Services offering moral support. All these people whose respect she valued, waiting to hear her explain her moment of cowardice. "I was afraid," she said simply. "I was afraid of getting involved, afraid of making things worse, afraid of putting myself at risk. I stood at my window for nearly 4 minutes watching someone fight for her life. And I did nothing because I assumed someone else would handle it." The defense attorney seized on her admission during cross-examination. "So you admit you failed in your civic duty? That your inaction potentially contributed to Ms. Morrison's extended captivity?" Each question was designed to wound, and they succeeded. But Jade answered honestly, refusing to minimize her failures or make excuses. "Yes, I failed. My inaction was inexcusable. But that failure taught me something important about the difference between being a good person in theory and being good when it actually matters." After her testimony, Jade walked out of the courthouse into bright afternoon sunlight. Hannah Morrison was waiting on the steps, looking fragile but determined. They'd spoken several times since the rescue, but each conversation carried the weight of those 4 minutes when Jade had watched instead of acted. "Thank you," Hannah said quietly, "for not giving up, for finding me." "I should have helped you from the beginning," Jade replied. "I should have." "You did help me," Hannah interrupted. "Maybe not in the first 4 minutes, but when it counted most, you put yourself at risk to bring me home. That matters more than you know." Walking home through the familiar neighborhood streets, Jade reflected on everything that had changed since that night in March. Her job remained the same. She still advocated for vulnerable families, still fought bureaucratic systems that moved too slowly to protect children. But her approach had fundamentally shifted. She no longer waited for someone else to make the hard decisions or take the difficult stands. Last week, she'd testified before the city council about inadequate lighting in the alley where Hannah was attacked. She'd organized her neighbors into a safety watch group, teaching them to recognize signs of domestic violence and how to intervene safely. She'd even convinced her apartment building's management to install security cameras in all common areas. Most importantly, she'd started leading a support group for bystanders, people who'd witnessed crimes or emergencies and struggled with their response. The first meeting had drawn 12 people, including Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the elderly woman who'd been the only witness to call 911 that night. I called because I remembered being young and afraid once, Mrs. Patterson had shared with the group. A man was attacking my friend outside a dance hall in 1962. I was 17 and terrified, but I screamed and screamed until people came running. My friend lived because I found my voice when it mattered. I never wanted to feel helpless again. The support group sessions had taught Jade that the bystander effect wasn't just about individual moral failure. It was a systemic problem that required systemic solutions. They'd worked with local police to establish clear protocols for witnesses. They'd lobbied for better emergency response systems. They'd created educational programs about overcoming the psychological barriers that prevented good people from acting in crisis situations. Tommy Russo had been sentenced to 15 years for kidnapping and assault. During his sentencing hearing, his sister had testified about the sexual abuse she'd endured and the system's failure to protect her adequately. It was a reminder that victims and perpetrators were often created by the same social failures, the same tendency of good people to assume someone else would handle the difficult problems. 6 months after Hannah's rescue, Jade received an unexpected phone call. A woman named Sarah Chen, no relation to Detective Chen, had seen a news story about the Bystander Effect support group and wanted to share her own story. "I was raped in a parking garage 2 years ago," Sarah said. "There were at least 20 people who could have heard me screaming, but nobody came. Nobody called security. I've been in therapy ever since, trying to understand how so many people could just ignore someone in distress." Sarah joined the support group, bringing with her a perspective that challenged everyone's assumptions. She wasn't angry at the witnesses who'd failed to help her. She was determined to prevent others from experiencing the same isolation and abandonment. "The worst part wasn't the attack," she told the group. "It was realizing afterward that my neighbors had heard me screaming and chosen to ignore it. That made me feel like my life didn't matter, like my suffering was someone else's problem." Stories like Sarah's reinforced Jade's growing understanding that the bystander effect wasn't just about individual moments of moral failure. It was about fundamental questions of community responsibility and human connection. Every time someone chose not to get involved, they were making a statement about whose lives mattered and whose suffering could be ignored. A year after that night in March, Jade received a letter that made her cry in her kitchen. It was from a teenager named Marcus Williams, who'd been getting bullied at school until his teacher, someone who'd attended one of Jade's bystander intervention workshops, finally stepped in to stop it. "She said she learned from you that being a good person means acting like a good person, especially when it's hard," Marcus had written. "I wanted you to know that someone cared enough to help me, and it changed everything." These ripple effects reminded Jade that while she couldn't undo her original failure, she could ensure it led to something meaningful. Every person who learned to overcome the bystander effect, every potential victim who was helped instead of ignored, every moment of courage that replaced paralysis, these were her real testimony to Hannah Morrison and to herself. Standing at her apartment window now, the same window where she'd once frozen in crisis, Jade no longer saw just an alley. She saw a community where people looked out for each other, where witnesses had been trained to act, where the assumption that someone else will handle it had been replaced with the understanding that each person had responsibility to be that someone else. The screaming that had stopped at 11:47 p.m. on a night in March had started something that would never stop, a commitment to ensure that no one would have to suffer alone while good people stood by doing nothing, ready to face the uncomfortable truth about the bystander effect. Subscribe to our channel for more psychological insights that challenge how we see ourselves and our communities. Share this story with someone who needs to understand the power of action over inaction, and comment below. What would you do when faced with someone else's emergency? Your response might save a life someday. Hit that notification bell, because the next story could reveal something about human nature that changes everything you thought you knew about courage, community, and the responsibility we all share to protect each other.